Crioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 265, The Social Gospel Movement in Wales. Today, we're journeying into one of the most turbulent and fascinating and morally charging periods in the history of Wales. Those 2 decades between 1890 and 1913, when the valleys of the South thundered with coal, when the streets were crowded with migrants from across Britain and Ireland, when a remarkable group of preachers, ministers, and reformers stood in the gap between the new industrial order and the ancient call of church and the gospel. Today's episode is entitled Gospelers in Wales, and we're going to explore how the chapel, that pillar of Welsh life for hundreds of years, grappled with industrialization, poverty, labor unrest, and the rise of socialism. We'll meet some extraordinary characters: the evangelical pioneers of the Forward Movement, a Welsh-born Methodist firebrand who took London by storm, a poet-preacher who translated the Internationale into Welsh, and the first Labour MP who has credited Jesus of Nazareth more than Karl Marx for his convictions. So, let us begin. To understand what the social gospel movement is, we need to talk about it in historical depth. Social gospel movement was an understanding of Christianity which was much more evaluated around the idea of the care for others. It's been something that has been brewing for a while, and we're seeing kind of the aftermath of industrialization and the problem it's causing for everyday people, for the poor amongst everyone, and the results of unrestrained capitalism and how it is developing a society which is beaten and bitter. And because of this, there's a lot of philosophical movements that kick off because of it, one of which, of course, being Marxism, because of this idea that the individual, the worker in this case, is not as powerful and is not able to do stuff that, say, the rich are able to do. Uh, because of this, you have this whole movement built up around taking back power for the worker. So that leads into a whole discussion, which then becomes a philosophical discussion about who people are responsible for, and an evaluation that, to some degree, Christianity is built the same way. And so, in that, there are people who are in charge who control your access to God. And that is less the case in the 1800s than it would have been, say, in the 1300s, but there definitely is a bit of that perception. And so, as a lot of people will realize from the title, the backlash of this, or the result of this, is a lot of church ministers and church officials and average everyday people start to think about the gospel and the message of the gospel and compare it to the modern systems that they're living in, and start to make the argument that the idea that Jesus would be happy with a bunch of his followers basically being treated in a way that was not kind and not Christ-like would be something that they would have to respond to. And this movement is a worldwide movement. It certainly is not a Welsh movement, but it does take place in our discussions today, largely in Wales, when we talk about the Welsh response and why this becomes so important. So, for most of its history, as anyone who's listened to this podcast for any length of time will know, Wales has been a land of farms, mountains, and small market towns. Religious life, dominated typically by nonconformists for many, many years, has been importantly a major part of that. Calvinist Methodists, Congregationalists, Baptists, and Wesleyans are making up a large amount of the rural character of Wales. But from the 1840s onwards, coal also begins to change everything. Steam coal was, of course, discovered in the Kinnan Valley and the Ronda. Barely a scattered handful of farmsteads at this point in 1861 explode into a major population. By 1881, Ronda held 55,000 people. By 1921, it will hold over 162,000 people, and that's just one valley amongst many. By the 1890s, the docks of South Wales were handling 38% of all the British coal exports, a quarter of the world's entire coal trade. The South Wales coalfields, which at its peak around 1913 employed over 250,000 men, was the engine of the empire. It helped the British Navy sail and control so much of the seas. And into this engine poured people from the English Midlands, the West Country, and from Ireland, from Scotland, and between 1881 to 1891 alone, over 76,000 people moved into Glamorgan, the county which covers Cardiff and surrounding valleys. By 1914, the Welsh population had grown from 1.2 million to an estimated 2.5 million in a very short period of time. Relatively, anyway. This transformation placed extraordinary pressures on the chapels. Nonconformity had been the spiritual backbone of Welsh life since the Methodist revival of the 18th century. In places like Merthyr Tydfil, Aberdare, Llanelli, and Neath, nonconformist chapels had become what historians have described as the citadels of dissent, their ministers and deacons wielding powerful influence amongst emerging working classes. But now, thousands of newcomers were pouring into the valleys who had no connection to the Welsh chapel culture. Many were not even going to church at all. English speaking and indifferent to the Welsh language tradition also animated a lot of the thinking and thought process at a time when nonconformism relied on the Welsh language quite frequently. The established church, such as the Church of England, fared even worse. Rooted in rural social structures tied to the landed gentry, it found itself profoundly ill-suited for the democratic world of industrial South Wales. As one historian of the period noted, the church's ministry had developed in a rural setting and was consequently more pastoral than evangelical, and it had accepted the social gradation of an agricultural society, which did not apply to an industrial one. Meanwhile, the social condition in the valleys, as we very much discussed, were grim. Mine laborers were in dangerous conditions, wages often linked to the amount of coal produced, which meant that working in a difficult seam would lead to someone being penniless if they couldn't actually get a lot of coal out of it. Housing was cramped, sanitation poor, and poverty endemic to the area. Socialism, as mentioned previously, was beginning to gain ground rapidly in the industrial areas, accompanied by what historians call the increasing politicization of the religious nonconformists. So, in other words, that religious groups were also becoming very active in talking about politics. This, then, was the world that social gospelers inherited. A Wales bursting at its seams, spiritually hungry, economically volatile, and politically awakened. The question they posed was urgent. What does the gospel of Jesus Christ say to a man who cannot feed his family on a miner's wage? And that is quite literally the thesis of the social gospels. How do we reach people in a way that hits them at their very soul if you can't, get them to a place where they're not worrying about where their next bit of food is going to come from, where the next pound and pence and shilling is going to come from? All of that was a concern, and it was definitely something that they talked a lot about. The social gospel movement was something that emerged from the Protestant world, particularly founded in Britain and North America in the late 19th century. Its central convictions was that Christianity demanded not merely individual salvation, and personal piety, which would be obvious, but active engagement with structural injustices of the industrial society. Poverty was not simply the result of individual moral failure, it was a product of the unjust systems and the exploitative practices and the social sins of those practices. And if Christ came to redeem the whole world, then the church had a duty to challenge those systems. Kind of ironic. I'm not going to get into politics, but kind of ironic versus some of the things going on today, but I'm not going to get into it. In the United States, figures like Walter Rauschenbusch, whose landmark book Christianity and the Social Crisis appeared in 1907, gave the social gospel movement its powerful theological articulation. Rauschenbusch argued that the kingdom of God required social as well as individual salvation. He urged Christians to seek labor rights, poverty relief, and economic justice as gospel imperatives. In Britain, the traditions had deep roots. Christian socialism had been championed since the 1840s by figures like F.D. Morris and Charles Kingsley. By 1880s and 1890s, a new generation had extended and radicalized this tradition. Settlement houses opened in urban slums. Methodist central halls were built in social work centers as well as places of worship. A forward movement within British Methodism, launched in the 1880s, explicitly combined evangelical missions with social outreach. And Wales, with its dense nonconformist culture and its rapid industrialization in the South, was a hotbed of this idea of traditions of fiery prophetic preaching and would obviously be a fertile ground for this social gospel movement. So, in the Welsh context, our story properly begins in 1891 in a tent pitched in the ground in Splot, Cardiff, then a rapidly expanding district of workers' housing in the eastern edge of the city. The man who erected that tent was Reverend John Pugh, a Calvinistic Methodist from Carmarthenshire, born in 1846. He had already served in the churches at Tredegar and Pontypridd, as well as Cardiff. Pugh was deeply troubled by what he saw. The Calvinistic denomination, which formed the backbone of Welsh nonconformity, had developed largely in Welsh-speaking agricultural Wales. Its culture, its language, its modes of worship were ill-fitting to English-speaking industrial slums of Cardiff and the valleys. Thousands of working-class migrants had no contact with the chapel at all. In 1891, Pugh visited his friend Seth Joshua in Neath, where Joshua's brother Seth and Frank were already using tents as mobile mission stations to reach the, as they call them, the unchurched, or people who don't follow the gospel. What Pugh and Joshua began that year, or I shouldn't say didn't follow the gospel, but weren't necessarily following a church, not going to church, in other words. I should say it that way. So I'll try and from here forward, try and remember to use that terminology. What Pugh and Joshua began that year in Cardiff was soon formalized by the Catholic Methodist General Assembly in Machynlleth in 1892, which officially sanctioned a new missionary initiative, the Forward Movement. The name itself was borrowed from a broader Methodist impulse. In England, the Methodist leader William Fiddlin Moulton, not Fiddlin. In England, the Methodist leader William Fidian Moulton had encouraged the expression. A Welsh minister by the name of Hugh Price Hughes, of whom we'll hear a bit more shortly, had become the unofficial leader of the Forward Movement across the British Methodism. But in Wales, under Pugh's leadership, the movement took on its own vivid character. The Dictionary of Welsh Biography records that during his superintendency, John Pugh started no fewer than 48 mission halls across South Wales, as well as a home for destitute women entitled the Kingswood Treborth Home in Cardiff. To publicize the work, he founded and edited a succession of monthly papers: the Christian Standard from 1891 to 93, the Forward Movement Herald of 1897, the forward movement torch from 1899 to 1904. Pugh died on Palm Sunday, 1907, having poured his life into his work. At his side through much of this period was Seth Joshua, the man of extraordinary energy and warmth. Born in Pontypool in 1858, the son of an ironworker, Joshua had been converted through the Salvation Army and brought the Army's directness and emotional urgency into his preaching. One historian has described the forward movement as a, quote, romance of faith in a harsh world of social deprivation, sometimes shameful poverty, end quote. That phrase captures something of Seth Joshua's spirit perfectly. Joshua was no armchair reformer. He and his brother Frank tramped the valleys, preaching in open air, in tents, in wooden huts, and in any space they could find, reaching the miners and ironworkers who would never darken the door of a conventional chapel. Seth Joshua had a particular gift for commanding total attention, and his directness could be startling. But there is a theological seriousness beneath the wit. The forward movement was not, it should be said, a fully developed social gospel enterprise. And in Rauschenbusch's sense, its primary drive was evangelistic, seeking to bring individuals into personal faith. What made the social gospel movement was the recognition that you could not separate the spiritual from the temporal or the material. You had to reach out to people where they were. You had to go to the slums, to the pits, and actually do more than just be a presence there, do more than just be a building or just be a name or just be a person. You had to be something more than that for these people. And that the church effectively was abandoning its duty if it didn't do more than what it was doing. Seth Joshua's life also connects our story with the dramatic events of 1904 and 5. It was Joshua who, on 29th of September 1904, preaching at Blaenoriacht, a conference gathering for spiritual deepening, he made a heartfelt plea asking, "Humble us, O Lord." Among those in the congregation listening was a young ex-miner from Lower, Evan Roberts. Within weeks of this great religious revival, one that was probably the largest in a generation, had suddenly swept the coalfields. The forward movement helped prepare the ground. If Seth Joshua and John Pugh were the grassroots faces of the social gospel movement, then Hugh Price Hughes it was its most nationally prominent Welsh exponent. Though he exercised his ministry primarily in London, you could tell by his name he was obviously Welsh. Hughes was born on the 8th of February, 1847 in Carmarthen. A son of a doctor, he was raised in the professional class of South Wales and trained as a Wesleyan minister. Energetic, prolific, and sometimes combative, he had a restless conviction that the church must engage the world on the world's terms. He was, as a West London mission's own records say, quote, an energetic proponent of social Christianity, end quote. The very title of one of his published books. In 1887, Hughes established the West London Mission in St. James Hall in Piccadilly. The opening service drew over 2,000 people. The mission became a remarkable experiment in what might today be called a community ministry, combining evangelical worship with a wide range of social outreach. In the West End of London, where extreme poverty existed cheek by jowl with great wealth, the mission ran rescue services, providing help for women in desperate circumstances and engaged with full human reality of urban poverty. Hughes was elected the president of the Wesleyan Methodist Conference in 1898 to 1899, a remarkable mark of esteem for him as an individual. One of his first acts was to convene a special convention in the Wesleyan district across the country. His Welsh connections remained strong, and he used his presidency to help join the North and South Wales synods together, giving Wales its first great Wesleyan assembly, over which he presided himself. A contemporary Welsh newspaper described him at his death in 1902 As one who had been an author, editor, temperance worker, educationalist, social reformer, and religious leader, his advocacy, though sometimes cautious by the standard of the more radical social gospelers, was rooted in genuine conviction. In 1889, he declared, quote, "All law and all policy ought to be shaped in the interest of the poor," end quote, and he meant it. It's worth noting that Hughes declined a parliamentary candidacy in 1885 precisely because he believed his calling was to the pulpit rather than Westminster. Yet his sense of political duty was intense. This tension between prophetic witness and direct political action was one that would recur across the social gospel tradition in Wales throughout our period that we're discussing. As I said, Hugh Price Hughes died in November 1902. His death came before the great coal strikes of the 1910 and 11 period that we've talked about, before the constitutional crisis, and before the First World War. What would he have made of the world had he lived beyond those periods to see just how changed it would be in basically 20 years? No account of the social gospels in Wales in this period can pass without a sustained attention to one of the most remarkable figures in British political history, Keir Hardie, the first Labour MP, founder of the Independent Labour Party from 1900 until his death in 1915, and a member of Parliament for Merthyr Tydfil and Aberdare. Hardie was not Welsh by birth. He was a Scotsman born in Lanarkshire in 1856, but Wales claimed him, and he claimed Wales. Merthyr Tydfil, one of the cradles of the Welsh industrial radicalism, returned him to Parliament in October of 1900, and Hardie's relationship to Christianity is central to understanding both his politics and his appeal in a chapel-going constituency like Merthyr. He had been brought up as an atheist, but turned to Christianity in the 1870s, an act bound up with his involvement in the temperance movement. As one biographer noted, the temperance movement in this period was not the marginal, narrow-minded affair we might today imagine. It commanded widespread working-class support. It ran non-alcoholic pubs and hotels and provided a rich web of social and leisure activities. It was through temperance that Hardie, a young miners' leader and union organizer, was drawn to evangelical Christianity. And his Christianity was a very particular kind. In 1910, Hardie stated publicly, quote, "The impetus which drove me first into the labor movement and the inspiration which carried me on to it has been derived more from the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth than from all other sources combined," end quote. This was not a rhetorical flourish. Hardie's faith was, in his own words, the faith of the Sermon on the Mount, fiercely egalitarian, prophetically challenging to church leaders who justified profit or turned a blind eye to exploitation. Think about it this way. Much like in our own time, there's a dichotomy in Christian thought, which I don't want to get into too much because I realize that that's going down a path that most people either won't be interested in or B, won't agree with, but that came out of what's known as Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, in which the concepts of showing your devotion to God meant that you were rewarded. Now, of course, that's not special out of Christianity at any point, but the key point of that is that if you work hard, God cares for you and makes sure that things go well for you. Now, that kind of goes against a lot of the more extreme sides of Protestantism, which didn't believe you had any ability to work your way into salvation. But it became almost this idea that to show, success in normal realms in the practical world, let's say, it showed that God was favoring you, and it became really largely built up in places like the United States, where this concept continued to grow. And you would have a lot of people saying, well, that they got wealthy because they were really devoted Christians, and their faith in Christianity through that, God has blessed them. They donated their time and their effort to the church, and God has looked after them. Without being mean, it's kind of laughable, because what about the people who, worked just as hard, had just as much faith, and they didn't have this grand economic success? That's never quite measured into that argument. So it's one of those things where it becomes kind of infuriating, because it doesn't have a realistic sense to it. So, with all that said, like I said, I don't want to get into the whole politics of it, but it does kind of spin off. And in a way, this is kind of the backlash to that whole discussion, because these are people looking at the Bible, where Christ is not talking about the success of someone. The rich person can't enter heaven unless they go through the eye of a needle. It's something of a sticking point, one might even say. So, how does that measure with this argument of you know Christianity leading to commercial and economic success? That's where the whole divide starts to kick in. So this is kind of a backlash of that. To me, this entire philosophy is way more similar to what the monks were doing in the Middle Ages, wherein they were looking after the poor, where they would, act as a way station for poor travelers so that they could get about without having to spend money on hotels and pubs. They could feed them a small amount of food and sort of be there for them. They looked after the sick. It was something which disappeared with the end of the monasteries and wasn't well replaced for many, many years. Because of that, of course, more and more the government had to take on those responsibilities, which is how we get to today. But in this time period, you have people going back to the Bible and saying, hey, I don't remember Jesus being all, oh, the heck with the poor, or, or the other side of it, which is that the poor, they're 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 poor. That's their lot. Eventually they'll go to heaven and they'll be rewarded for being poor all the time. I you know, this is the kind of thing that people start to argue is not how Christians should work. And so they start to build up these movements. It leads to things in our modern age where a lot of Christian churches will run food kitchens. That's an outgrowth of the social gospel movement. It's an idea that you must care for the poor. You must be there, especially for the very destitute, the homeless, people who literally cannot care for themselves. And this is what it leads to. Now, there's one distinct feature of social gospel tradition in the Welsh tradition, which is the intimate and sometimes intense relationship between chapel culture, the labor movement, and individuals who embodied both. Here, Hardy, for example, did not preach from a pulpit, but he preached nonetheless, and his speeches in Merthyr had the cadence of the chapel, the authority of the prophet. In Welsh valleys, where so many of his constituents had grown up hearing the Bible expounded with passion and learning every Sunday, this resonated deeply. Think of it like Martin Luther King. Here's someone who was a preacher and knew how to talk like a preacher. He could get the interest of people because he talked like a trained, educated, and charismatic preacher. So if you think of it like that, you can see why these kinds of people would have an outsized sense of influence because of their links to both the church and to being able to speak at a political level. Keir Hardy's Merthyr was also, let's be clear, a place of raw poverty and industrial danger. The coal industry was powerful, coal owners themselves, of course, were powerful, and the state, as events over the next few years would prove, would dramatically demonstrate was not neutral in this discussion. When a dispute with the Cambrian Combine locked out 800 men, as we talked about in our last episode, and 12,000 miners came in to support, the violence that was long and bitter amongst this strike, which brought police and eventually soldiers to the Ronda, Hardy was there, denouncing the deployment of military force against workers and challenging the Home Secretary to justify the confrontation. The relationship between the chapels and the strikes of 1910 and 11 was complex. Some ministers supported the miners with sermons and solidarity, others called for order and moderation. The social gospel impulse, the idea that God's justice demanded more than personal piety, was tested severely in those winter months in the valleys. Now, to move along in our discussion, if Keir Hardie represented the meeting of Christianity and the labor movement in the political arena, then Thomas Evans Nicholas, known to the Welsh world as Nicholas y Glees, represented that meeting the most vivid and uncompromising form. He was a congregational minister who translated the Internationale into Welsh, who preached socialist revolution from the chapel pulpit, and who acted as Hardie's election agent in 1910. Nicholas was born in 1879 in Llanfirnocht parish in Pembrokeshire. The son of a small farmer and stonemason, he later recalled, quote, "Times were hard. There were 6 children in the family, and y Llety was a rented small householding." End quote. The precariousness of rural life and the presence of the landlord at the door, the sense of community solidarity against poverty, these early experiences never left him. He was ordained amongst Welsh independents, or Congregationalists, and in 1904 became a minister of the Sion Chapel in the village of Glees in Swansea Valley, where he would remain until 1914. He is remembered there still. Nicholas Road in the valley bears his name. At Glees, Nicholas became one of the most extraordinary figures in Welsh culture and political life. His religious convictions were focused on what he saw as a radical social message of the Gospels, influenced by the radical tradition of Welsh poet and thinker R.J. Durfell, with its emphasis on brotherhood, peace, justice, equality, land nationalism, and the opposition to militarism, something that would be very much opposed in this period of British history. He thundered his prophetic gospel from the pulpit. He became a celebrated preacher at great open airs locations such as the Crithau Mawr, the big meeting, and a popular public speaker across the valleys. He won 17 Eisteddfods chairs during his decade at Glees, a testament to his genuine literary gift. His early poetry had a religious theme, but by 1908, his poems carried an increasingly socialist and radical message. His collection, Gwyrddiwr Cymru, Cenwch i'ch Gwneud i'ch Rhydydd, Worker of Wales, Sing Yourselves to Freedom, sold over 6,000 copies. He translated both the Internationale and the Red Flag into Welsh. He joined the Independent Labour Party in 1905, becoming a close friend and supporter to Keir Hardie. In 1910, Nicholas was an election agent in Merthyr, a role that put him at the heart of Welsh Labour politics during one of its most tumultuous years. The following year, at Hardie's personal request, Nicholas became the first Welsh-language editor of the IPL, Merthyr's pioneer newspaper, a post he held from the paper's first appearance in 1911. What makes Nicholas so fascinating in the context of the social gospel is that he refused any separation between faith and politics. For him, the gospel was inherently about justice, about the poor being lifted up, and about the rich being brought low. In the present world, not merely in the afterlife. His chapel at Glees became a space where Welsh culture, socialist politics, and Christian faith were woven into a single fabric. A choir, an Eisteddfod, political debate, and Sunday worship were all under one roof. In his later career, jailed during the Second World War on false charges, eventually a member of the Communist Party, though remaining a Christian, which is a story for a completely different episode. But in our period, he represented the most radical edge of the Welsh social gospel, the minister who stood at the pulpit and told the coal owners that God was not on their side. Of course, it would be a mistake, however, to present the Welsh social gospel movement is seamless and a unified movement. It was shot through with tensions, contradictions, and debates that are worth attending to honestly. This first tension was between evangelism and social reform. The forward movement of John Pugh and Seth Joshua was, at heart, an evangelical movement. Its primary aim was to bring individuals to personal faith in Jesus Christ. The social mission, the mission halls, and the homes for destitute women, was in service of the primary goal. For figures like Walter Rauschenbusch or the more radical British Christian socialists, this ordering of priorities was exactly wrong. Society itself needed redemption, not merely individuals within it. This tension was never fully resolved. Second tension was between the chapel and the labor movement. As socialists gained ground in the valley, especially after the formation of the Independent Labor Party in 1893 and the Labor Representation Committee of 1900, many nonconformist ministers found themselves in an awkward position. They shared the labor movement's concern for the poor. They often shared its critique of laissez faire capitalism, but they were wary of socialism, an idea that seemed to marginalize the role of the church, that offered secular salvation without God, and that could be, as some feared, materialist and godless. Robert Pope, in his definitive study of the building of Jerusalem, Nonconformity, Labor, and the Social Question in Wales, published in 1998, and is essential reading for anyone who wishes to explore this subject further, argues that the role of the chapel in this period has been systematically underestimated by historians focused on the secular culture of union lodges and workmen's institutes. Pope traces the emergence of the distinctively Welsh social gospel and its main protagonists and complex ways in which both engaged with and resisted the labor movement challenge. The third tension was around language. As you can imagine, in Wales, language makes up a huge part of the discussion. Welsh nonconformity has always been deeply tied to the Welsh language. Its hymns and its preaching tradition and its culture all are Welsh. But the industrialization of South Wales brought vast numbers of English speaking migrants to the area. The Forward movement deliberately chose to work in English in many of its new mission halls, a recognition of the demographic reality, but also a source of cultural anxiety. The proportion of Welsh speakers in the Rhondda Valley fell from 64% in 1901 to 55% 10 years later. Was the social gospel helping to erode the Welsh language and culture that had nourished it? And of course, that creates a massive amount of debate. Keep in mind that for many, many years, the rural Welsh speaking were the conservatives of this group. And now you have a movement which is more radical, more left leaning, and it's very much bound in English speaking, even though it's come from the same church traditions as the people who have effectively been the tradition for Wales for hundreds of years at this point. And finally, there was the question of what the social gospel achieved. By 1913, the end point of our period today, South Wales was on the eve of the Great War and the eve of a great coal strike, on the eve of decline that would devastate the valleys in the 1920s and 30s. The chapel had reached hundreds of thousands, both the gospel and social care. The Forward movement had built nearly 50 mission halls. Nicholas Iglas had given the working class a poetry and politics rooted in the gospel. Keir Hardie had taken the Labour seat in a Welsh valley and held it for 15 years. But poverty, as we would all know, persists. The coal owners remained powerful. The structures of inequality and industrial capitalism were not dismantled by chapel mission or prophetic preaching. The social gospel in Wales, and as elsewhere, could dramatize injustice, could immobilize compassion, could challenge the comfortable, but it could not alone transform economic order. So, with all that said, what is the legacy of the social gospel movement of Wales? There is immediate legacy, of course, which was institutional. The Forward movement transformed Calvinistic Methodist churches' reach amongst the English speaking working class in South Wales. Nearly 50 mission halls established under John Pugh created infrastructure and physical spaces for community gatherings, social care, and worship that outlasted the Victorian and Edwardian eras. The West London Mission, founded by Hugh Price Hughes, continued its social mission in London to this day, more than 135 years after its founding. Their deep legacy was cultural and political. The intimate relationships between the chapel and the labor movement, prophetic traditions, helped to create what Keir Hardie himself understood. At the Welsh Valleys, politics could be preached as well as organized. The moral seriousness of Welsh labor politics in the 20th century and its emphasis on community, on solidarity, on speaking truth to power owes a great deal to the chapel culture from which so many of its leaders would come from. Nicholas Igles stands as a reminder that the social gospel movement in Wales could genuinely be radical, not a taming of the gospel to make it more palatable to the powerful, but a deployment of the gospel as a weapon against the powerful. The tradition he represents, the minister as prophet, the sermon as political act, the chapel as space of resistance, is one of the most distinctive contributions to Welsh Christianity and to the global Christian thought. The social gospel movement in Wales during this era is a reminder of how religion and social change interact in ways that are irreducibly complex. The gospel does not simply legitimate the existing order, nor does it simply overthrow it. It is wrestled with, argued with, preached at, sometimes betrayed, sometimes heroically. The social gospelers in the period were not perfect, but they were present. Present in the slums, present in the valleys, present in the pit gates and the mission halls, asking the hardest possible question: what does faithfulness to Jesus Christ require of us in this world? In this moment, in this place, it is a question that realistically, if you are a Christian follower, should not have gone out of date. I think the social gospel movement for me has always been one of great interest. I think because it's a period that I was very focused on when I took university, but also because I think it sets the foundations for what becomes our ideals of socialism, and both the conflict of it and the value of it, depending on your point of view, of course, and how it influences societies across Europe and Canada and Australia and, yes, in the United States, even today, and how much of it derives from a sense of doing the right thing. And I think it's a significant step in changing the way things were spinning out of control in a period where massive capitalism, uncontrolled, unrefined, and effectively ungoverned, was creating a situation wherein there was such an imbalance that people had to respond. And I think that's what a lot of these churchgoers started to realize, a lot of these preachers. In a way, you can think of it as similar to the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, wherein a lot of the pressure started from the church pulpit, from ministers, from people who had deeply felt faith beliefs that drove them to take part in these social movements in a way that maybe 100 years prior they never would have, where they might have actually have been contributors to this side of society. And I think that's a massive change that we see in modern times. And in a way, we'll talk more about this kind of radical change in thinking, especially about democracy and about how people should be able to access it, which comes in this period as well. So, with all that said and done, thank you all so much. And if you're wanting further information about it, if you want to know more, the one book I could recommend is Robert Pope's Building Jerusalem. It is very much a well covered subject there. And I think it gives you a better understanding of where a lot of the thought processes of today originate. So I think it's a great thing to read. But either which way, thank you all for listening or viewing today. Thank you once again to all of my patrons who are helping to finance this podcast. You should have received, if I'm calculating correctly, the first episode of my tours around Britain for, in this case, Roman Britain. That should be in your feeds. So please check it out. I hope you like it. Give me feedback because I'd be curious to know what you think. And hopefully there will be much more to come on that front. But in the meantime, everyone, take care. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. If you need to contact me or have questions, you can always reach out to me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. That's my email account. I do respond. Also, typically on social media at Welsh History Pod, and except for on Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And if you do want to become a part of the Patreon community, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you once again. I hope you have a great day. Take care. Ta-ra. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.